Hi everyone and welcome to Haven Knox-Johnston Spring Checks webinar. A huge thank you to Charlie McLaren for allowing us to use his boat Viod 2. It was a very interesting experience. We had a great fun doing all the filming on there. Huge thank you to Charlie. And so without further ado, gonna sort of hand you off to Ben. Ben Sutcliffe is a very experienced marine surveyor. He was basically born into the marine industry and has been surveying since God was in shorts. He's a member of the Yacht Designers and Surveyors Association, the STMS and the RYA, and is here to impart his expertise and fount of knowledge to you all with regard to all the spring checks and everything going on. So without further ado, over to you, Ben.
Morning, Paul. Morning, everyone. Well, as Paul said, we had a great time with Charlie down on the Thames a couple of weeks ago. We actually pulled the sunshine out, didn't we? So
we booked it.
We've managed to put this little set of different items here together. So I think the first one we'll start with is the safety equipment. And basically, one of the things that always surprises me is how the deterioration of items like life belts happens so much quicker these days than they did years ago, and things like the lights that deteriorate or the batteries that go. I mean, a great tip is if you're not using those pieces of equipment and the boat is tied up, why not put the life belts below and keep them out of the way of the UV light? But when obviously before you set sail or set off from anywhere, get them back out and make sure that everything is working on them correctly. Make sure the lights are working. That particular type of life belt, obviously if you throw that, it's quite heavy, but if you have the horseshoe life belts like a lot of yachts and powerboats have, just be wary of the fact that when you throw it, it will blow away from where you're throwing it. So they should come with a little drogue, and ideally have two, one with a floating line and one with a drogue and a light on it, almost like the MCA recommend for commercial boats. And again, on big boats like the barges, if you were to lose someone over the side, it's not a bad idea to have a Dan buoy of some sort that you can chuck in the water straight away to give you a bit of an idea, because turning a barge around takes a little bit longer than perhaps turning a 23-foot yacht round or a little speedboat round. So it's something worth having, and also make sure that you've got a second member on board who can actually spot the person as well. But we had a look around on safety equipment, obviously things like that, flares. It's amazing how quickly flares go out of date. I'm sure everyone's going to probably blog into you in a minute, Paul, asking where do you dispose of flares, because that's just like the nightmare scenario for all of us these days. But normally most people who sell flares will take almost one for one back, or will start charging you to dispose of them. Do not keep old flares on board. They're really not a good idea. I've actually been to some boats where the flares were actually 15 years older than the boat I was actually on, because people have just taken them from one to the other. And then things like your life jackets. If you've got auto-inflate life jackets, make sure that your life jackets are actually okay. Cylinders are okay. Now, some people will send them off to one of the service centres to have them checked, which I think is personally a good idea. But also the other things you can look at is, if you're competent, you can open them up and check the canister date is okay and the firing equipment is all in date. But you know, life jackets are really important as well. So there's lots of safety equipment that the Coast Guard and other people do recommend that you should look at, and certainly on the RWA website as well, there's lots of safety equipment. And fire extinguishers is again really important. And I think, am I right in saying, Paul, that a lot of powerboats, if it's over 18 knots, is it, they have to have a fire extinguisher in the engine room. So again, it's important that you know what you're doing there, and try and avoid dry powder in engine rooms, because they are not very good when they go off. Okay, shall we go on to the next slide? So nav lights. A lot of people don't actually appreciate how quickly, again, the UV light, I mean, it's probably going to be the story of my life in this webinar. With the global warming, we are seeing a definite difference in the way materials react, and UV light on a port light here, for instance, 4 or 5 years in the sunlight, and the lenses are starting to break down now. If you look at any of the co-regs, you know, a vessel of the size we were on, that light's going to be visible from 5 miles at night, and it's probably going to be doing well. And again, if you're not using them and they're accessible, why not slip some little covers over them? You know, a bit like the deck hatches, you know, put something over them to help protect them. But also regular checks. At the start of the season, we went round the barge and we checked all the lights were working, or in the case we actually found a fault, ironically, with this particular light system. And it's good because doing that spring check makes you actually think, let's just check all these things. On a yacht, it's quite hard sometimes with the tricolour at the top of the mast. And again, it's something to do at night and from a distance, flick it on and go away from the boat enough to actually see that the lens is actually correct. One of the classic ones I've actually had is where the lens had been screwed on by someone on the mast. When they put the mast up, the white was in the wrong direction and the red and the green were facing aft. So it's really important to make sure that whoever's putting these things on for you is actually turning them in the right direction to start with. Okay, shall we flick on to the next one?
Just a quick one, Ben. Questions just come in. With regards to fire extinguishers, you say avoid powder in an engine room. What would you recommend instead?
The clean agents, like there's several different clean agents now being sold by one or two of the suppliers. Obviously, we're not allowed to give out brands and stuff, but the trouble with dry powder, and we've, well, not just your insurance company, but other insurance companies I've worked for in the past have had dry powders go off. And basically the powder gets into the engine, which messes up the turbo and God knows what else. But more importantly, the powder residue afterwards can actually damage your wiring. And before now, we've had quite expensive bills for replacing of wiring looms. And a lot of people in the older days, you know, you go on the old Sea Lions and Seamasters and Princesses and Powell's boats, they'd have one fire extinguisher over the top of each engine. We know that now is not a good idea. It's better to have a big enough fire extinguisher for the whole compartment, because funny enough, I've been to one where the guy had 3 fire extinguishers and not one of them was big enough for the whole compartment. So the first one tried to put the fire out and failed. And about 20 minutes later, the second one came on and tried to put the fire out and didn't quite have enough. And then the fire came back a third time and the third one went off and that didn't work. And then the boat burnt to the waterline. So it's make sure you have enough agent for the engine room. And also if you've got automatics and you've got air extraction, again, making sure that the air extraction has a means of turning off, because if not, when you discharge all that gas into the compartment to put the fire out, the first thing you're doing is pumping it overboard to stop it working. So that's worth being aware of.
And I assume that the area that the fire extinguisher's got to cover is, there'll be something on the side of the fire extinguisher to say what sort of area it's used for?
Normally, the manufacturer or the supplier, the agent, will calculate it with you. So give you an example, I did a Cheetah Cat the other week, and that was a 5 cubic meter engine compartment. And the one they supplied was about 8 cubic meters because they gave a 30% extra. So you make sure you're well inside the rules. And I think that's about 250, 300 pounds, something like that. But they get more expensive when you start putting autos and remote pulls and systems that tell you the fire extinguisher is working. There's several really good manufacturers out there who I'm sure would love to have people's business. Best thing is, like everything else, is shop around, you know. All right.
Thank you.
No probs. What's the next one?
Erosion.
Erosion, yes. Corrosion is quite something important to look at, and certainly after a winter of frost and snow laying on boats, just little small chips that happen on things will start corrosion off quite spectacularly. Now, interestingly enough, on Charlie's boat, he's used, it was Deck Solé, wasn't it?
Something like that.
Yeah, and he's used that. Oh, let's just pause that there a second, Chris. He's used that on his decks, and that's been really good. Because no matter what happens and lands on the decks, the oil there's an oil-based product there, and it's not slippery to walk on. I was quite impressed with it. You know, I've seen it used on timber for years, but I've never really seen many people use it on steel and iron in the past. But one of the things that we're just pointing out here is the what's called jacking, which is when corrosion starts underneath an area where the plating has been welded, or in this case riveted on, and water getting underneath, the corrosion starting to expand and starting to push the plating apart. So it's really important to get on top of it early and keep these things clean and corrosion free. And again, if you're painting topsides, you can carry on, Chris, on that one now, thanks. Again, if you're painting, as you can see there, there's areas of flaking paint. It's really important to clean really hard back and then repaint over the top so that it's got a good attachment and onto the paintwork. You know, sometimes you find that people, it's the slightest little bit of damage like we've got here, and very quickly the corrosion can get in behind the seam weld and the plate welding and starts the corrosion off. And obviously all the white plimsoll line there and then the actual blacking below it, or in this case epoxy below it, starts getting corrosion stains on it. Charlie spent a lot of time on his boat prepping it and epoxying it. And what's really good is even where there are indents on the beltings there, he's had someone go in and weld them all up, so there's no chance of the corrosion starting. Whereas the boat near his boat, as you can see here, has got a lot of corrosion from the beltings, and certainly when you start looking around on the narrow boat and the inland waterway system, a lot of the boats that are built don't have the beltings fully welded top and bottom. So you start getting that jacking that we've just seen on his deck starting underneath, and the trouble is that is all caused by material loss and expansion of the corrosion as it starts to deteriorate. And when you start tapping out with a hammer, you notice you're starting to get a bit of plate loss there. So it's really important to try and ensure that any beltings on boats are fully welded top and bottom. And if there is an indent behind it, build up the weld and stop the corrosion going on. Okay.
And on that one, once it's got to that sort of stage in the picture we can see right now, what's the remedy for it? I assume it's not terminal.
No, it shouldn't be terminal if it's caught early enough. Obviously, the first thing is to get it cleaned back properly. Now, some people like the high pressure power wash system, which is not your normal pressure washer, but puts 20,000 psi through a hose, which is quite remarkable. You cut your arm off if you put your hand in front of it, or shot blasting it, or bead blasting it. You have to be a bit careful if you're doing it on an iron boat. It's not a great thing to overhit an iron boat, but steel's fine. And then obviously it's getting it prepped and cleaned up and sealed off as soon as possible, and making sure that there's not been significant loss of material underneath the plate, underneath the beltings there. If you have, then it's just a simple matter of cutting them off, cutting the D-bar off and cleaning up behind and replating or whatever, and then putting the D-bar back on. But that's exception extreme. Normally you can catch it much earlier. All right.
Thanks.
No sweat. Anchoring, yeah, anchors. Now Charlie has two anchors on his boat. One very large one on the starboard side there, and you can see the flukes are actually pointing outwards, which personally, if I was chugging off down the river, I would make sure they're flicked inwards. And then the other one is a slightly smaller one. Now he's got a rather nice set of winch gear here. Now I'm a grease fan. Charlie's an oil fan. All beautifully maintained there, and he's put an electric winch on. But as I say, seasonal checks. Check your ground tackle, because at the end of the day, whether you on a yacht or a powerboat or on a barge, metal will still deteriorate 365 days a year. So even if you haven't been on board the boat for the 6 months of the winter, it's a really good idea to lay your ground tackle out and actually physically see it all out. Now, what was interesting on this one was the shackles here had actually corroded quite spectacularly towards the end there. We've lost the last bit of the video there, but you can see that the corrosion has set in on the shackles. And again, you know, it's a really important point in that the weakest link is as strong as the weakest link, and you can see there that that's really not very clever. So again, I think we found Charlie another job to do on his boat before he chuckles off somewhere. But you know, no matter how much you own a boat, you're looking at it and thinking, yeah, this is all fine. But you know, it's like my own boat. I go out to Corfu, to Chianti, and the first thing I'll do before we put it in the water is we'll wind all that ground chain out and double check it. Before we put it away for winter, we washed all the chain, we made sure it was all clean, and we put a light grease, spray grease over the chain to stop it corroding in a pile. And as you can see here in the anchor locker, that the chain all sitting there has no protection on it. It's not galvanized, it's just straightforward iron link. And you'll get the corrosion developing in the bottom of the anchor locker there, and also chain laying on steel. Plating is never a particularly good idea. A lot of people will try and create a box or a tray or something to keep the chain away from the sides of the hull. And also, as you probably noticed, the access was not very good to get into that area, to go down and dig out all the muck and rubbish that's accumulating at the bottom. Yeah, there was threats of trying to hang me down there, but I didn't sort of take up to it.
I think that was your comments about grease that caused that one.
Well, yeah, it's a funny one, because one of the reasons why I prefer grease is the fact that it doesn't creep off in different directions. And obviously, with that anchor winch, you put oil onto it. If the anchor winch body isn't really well sealed to the deck, you've got a chance of oil going across your decks. Whereas grease is less likelihood of it. But I get the fact that dirt in the atmosphere and dirt picked up in grease. But I mean, we all have different ways of doing things. But my dad would sort of like once a month use some paraffin and wash everything down and then re-grease again. But everyone does things differently.
And question come in: how often would you reapply grease?
Well, it's a matter of how often does it get knocked off. Just keeping a monthly check on it, make sure it's all right. But there will be bearings in all these moving parts that should be regularly greased, and you can start seeing when the bearings get dry, because you'll see that there's no grease coming out the bearings. So it's a matter of regular checks. If you're using the winch weekly, then or regularly, very regularly, then weekly. If you're using it less, probably monthly. But the important thing at a spring check is to make sure what you've got on board works, because trust me, the last thing you want is a barge of that size losing its engine power and then finding that its anchor winch doesn't work, or it's jammed because it's seized. So this is why the idea is of spring checks. It doesn't matter whether you're a barge or a small sailing yacht or a big motorboat, just checking these things actually worked. And the most important one is make sure the bitter end is attached, isn't it? There's nothing better than setting all that ground chain out and then seeing the end of the chain plop over the front of the boat because you forgot to check it was attached. Don't use a shackle, don't use a hard fasting. Make sure you use a piece of cord or a stout piece of rope that is tied on, because then you've also got a quick release if you need to get rid of it. Okay. There's nothing worse than trying to saw through half-inch bar link chain, is there? In a hurry.
I don't think there's any hurry about that.
No, but you get my point, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the next one? Bite work. As with many barges, they do have some beautiful wood on them, around the collapsible wheelhouses. Charlie's one is a collapsible wheelhouse. And obviously a lot of yachts and a lot of motorboats have bite work, and it's important to keep on top of it. In this case, that hinges onto a metal L bracket. So the point where the corrosion or this water is going to be held regularly is in those little water traps, and also like the glazing beads. So when you're prepping your bite work, it's really important to make sure that all those edges where water can try and suck in are dealt with and cleaned up before you varnish. Because at the end of the day, or use the Dexolier, which is what some people have used as well. I think he was using Dexolier, wasn't this? Or was this 13 coats of varnish? I can't remember. But, there's an art to varnishing. I've got my toolbox, which is 44 years old now. And that came, it was a solid plank of wood when I started. And by the time I finished, it was a toolbox. But it had 15 coats of Blue Peter yacht varnish, which I think I can say because it's no longer made. But the first coat was literally 50% white spirit and 50% varnish. And you laid that on and sanded back. And then you put another coat on, sanded back. And then you went to 75% varnish and 25% thinners. and then did that and flour paper back, and eventually got to 13 coats of varnish. And as I say, it's never been revarnished. And the same with this. I know this is outside, but the key to good varnish work and bright work is preparation, making sure that the base timber is sound and dry, and then have the patience to put enough coats on. All right, but the water traps like we've got here of where the glazing beads are always going to be the places where your varnish will break down first, unfortunately. All right, so we're into underwater protection now. As we said, Charlie, when he bought the barge 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, wasn't it, took it and had it shot blasted, being steel, and has done a superb job on preservation of the iron and steel. Everything to do with steel has this ability to want to go back to Mother Earth. You know, if you don't protect it, it will find a way of dissolving itself and corrosion and trying to go back to Earth. So the most important thing to do is to seal steel as best as you can. And certainly when the modern epoxies were developed in the early 80s, the quality of them and the way they work are all very much the same, in the sense that you need the steel to be as clean and as bright as possible. Make sure you've removed, especially if you on the narrowboat system, a lot of narrowboats have what's called mill scale because the builders haven't shot blasted before they've painted them. So it's really important to remove the mill scale to start with, and then apply your coatings of epoxy on. And I think in this case he had about 5 coats of epoxy across the whole of the underside and around the top sides as well. And it does show. And then I think he's used 2 coats of a different epoxy on the top sides because of the UV light problems of some of the epoxies not being so UV tolerant. So in this case, it's kept the black a bit more shiny, whereas I'm sure a lot of you, if you're on the inland waterways, will notice people's boats are a little bit off grey, and that's normally the epoxy that's faded because there isn't such a good UV light tolerance in them. But it's better than have the boat rusting away. And certainly when we talk about inland waterway boats as well, doing your base plates, it's essential these days to have them deep cleaned, preferably shot blast, and epoxied with at least 5 coats. And again, Charlie's put anodes on here, but the anodes hardly do anything because everything is so well sealed up with epoxy. So all good stuff. And obviously, if you get any light bits of damage, get out there with your brush and start sealing them up as soon as possible. And then the last one on this exterior of the boat for checking is steerage. You'd be amazed at how many people launch their boat or set off in their boat without checking the steerage system. Now, on the barge, it's quite a unique steering system compared to a lot of people's boats, because on this particular boat of Charlie's that's come from the Dutch canal system, the previous owner had developed a very clever way that the rear end of the balanced rudder has another little bit of rudder attached to it, which as you turn it across, actually turns the end part of the foil to give him a bit more assistance and a bit more thrust of the propeller, which was quite a unique system. But with steerage, again, whether the boat before it's launched or at its mooring, physically checking the system all works, and steering cables in particular, you know, where they run through numerous pulleys from the binnacle or the steering wheel system that you've got, down through sets of pulleys, across back up to a quadrant at the back end of the boat. You'll be amazed at how many parts are all rubbing and pulling on different blocks and could be chafing on things. I think I've got one of my YouTube videos somewhere where the guy, when you turn the helm, one of the shore power cables has actually dropped down the helm, which while you're steering the boat at sea isn't a problem, but as soon as you plug it into shore power, the steering wheel could have potentially come live because the steering cable had actually started sawing through the shore power cable. So, you know, checking your systems is a really good idea. And obviously bearings and stern glands and rudder glands are all part of that, of the checking. So that's you know, from a point of view of spring checks before you go to sea with them. And again, hydraulics, if you've got hydraulic steering, a lot of them have a little top up by the wheel. Now, it's important to check that when the temperature is what I call sensible, because if it's very hot, the oil will have expanded, and if you do it then, when it gets back to a normal temperature, it will drop below the bearing. So, you know, what I call a sensible spring day, checking the oil level and putting the right oil in is a good move. Right, I think that's just...
Sorry, Ben. Yeah, do you need to be lifted out to check your rudder properly?
Yes, or on a grid or on scrubbing posts or whatever you can do. Certainly, you can see what's going on with the actual action of the wheel. And in this case, it has a set of chains running through the engine room, which is quite hard to film. So we gave up trying to do that. Back to the quadrant, but you can check all the bits and the moving parts and the anchorage points, like the pins where they connect to the wheel chain, and likewise the quadrant. And you can start seeing if there's a lot of slack. There is a bit of magic, black magic when it comes to wire steering, in the sense that if you have it too tight, it becomes a bit of a nightmare. But you don't want it too slack either. So there is a fine line between tensions on them. I learned that one on Chianti, because she's got Drummond wire, and it's quite fun trying to get the tension just right. But but obviously the actual blade itself, to check it, you would need to see the boat out of the water. Okay, we're into the inside. We went into Charlie's engine room, which is quite spectacular, bigger than most people's engine rooms. So we'll start off with the engine and the fuel filters. One of the things that was interesting with Charlie's boat, I'm just pointing out here, is the fact that, unlike a lot of barges, that had a turbo on it. Now, the barge itself is quite heavy, so the turbo is always kicking in. But on some boats, certainly on inland waterways and stuff, and even the powerboats and yachts, having a turbo, there's a point where you want either turbo on constantly or off. Running it in that, dropping in and out, can be a bit of a pain. So we were looking at a fuel filter, and I've actually dug one out of my treasure chest as well, just for this morning, because his filter is down. We're just pointing to it now, but on his one, you cannot see the bowl. It's a sealed bowl, which is all very well and good. But the trouble with that is, if it does get blocked, you can't, or you're having problems, you can't immediately glance at it and think, oh, look at the state of that. Can you see all that rubbish that was in there? You know, that's diesel bug in this one. So again, it's useful if you've got twins, and ironically, he has at the top of the picture there, you'll see a second one in there that was there for swapping over. And then obviously at the start of the season, I always say change your filters, make sure you've got plenty of spares. And going to the fuel tank, it's a good idea to drain off a bit of the fuel if possible from the bottom, to make sure that you haven't got the dreaded diesel bug from over winter. Hopefully, if you listen to our webinar at the start of the winter of keeping your fuel tanks pressed, that's a really good move. And again, checking all your fuel lines and fuel. There's a second fuel filter on the engine. Having all those things changed for the start of the season. Just doing what I call the basic engine checks. This engine is hard mounted, but again, I've brought this one along with me this morning. This is a typical engine, rubber engine mount, and really the engine should be set up about halfway down. Obviously, the alignment of the engine is important, but sometimes you look at things and it's not immediately obvious what the problem is. But in this case, this one had a severe problem where the rubber had devulcanized from water leak off the water pump, running down and causing corrosion. So checking your engine mounts and things like that are really important. Looking at the connections onto the shaft and the drive, again, are all really useful little spring checks to have a look at. But fuel management, I think, is the starting point, because 9 times out of 10, I think last year the probably of all the engine call outs they got, probably almost half of them were down to issues of fuel management or poor fuel or lack of filters or dirty fuel. So checking that, and you can get things like diesel polishing, which is worth having a look at. But if we go on to the next video, Chris, I think we've got a picture of the fuel tank, have we? I can't remember if we've got his fuel tank. But we're on 2 gearbox and linkages. Yeah, we'll do that one next, and we'll come back to the fuel in a minute. So checking, like the steering, looking where all your linkages come down through into the gearbox. So we've got this throttle linkage here on this. Now, obviously, this is quite big boat stuff compared to some of the small boat stuff. But again, it doesn't matter whether your boat is 100 foot long or 25 foot long. If you've got linkages, check them all okay. Make sure lock nuts are backed. Put your hands underneath the hoses like there, where your hydraulic oils are running. All little clues for where things leak. And I think down in this one here, we did actually pick up a couple of little things on the check. This hose, this blue hose here that you can see, was actually rubbing on the underside of the engine leg off the engine. Now, it's not so serious because that was hard mounted, but had it been on a rubber mount, there would have been a bit of movement on the support leg as well, so it would have created more faster corrosion. Checking the gearbox oils, something to be very wary of is, we've had people before now check gearbox oils without the engine running. So check with your manufacturer as to whether they should be checked when the engine is stopped or whether they should be checked when the engine is running. And sometimes there's a particular speed the engine needs to be turning at, and only then refill if it's then low at that point. Because before now we've had people dip the oil when the engine's not running, think, oh, there's hardly any oil in there, filled it up, and then blown all the gearbox seals because actually the oil was bang on mark, but the engine should have been running. So, and then likewise, we've got the gear shift linkage here, which I think you can restart that. Chris, we found that the bolt that secures to the gear shift had quite a lot of play in it, so we haven't taken it apart, but I would guess that amount of play, probably the bolt inside was a bit worn. Don't know if that's me paused or Fosen, but there we are. So we'll go back to the fuel now. So this is one of the 2 storage tanks of the fuel. In this particular boat, I think there's about 700 gallons or something. I'm sure Charlie will text in if he's listening to tell me if that's wrong, but I think that was right. We've got quite a nice inspection hatch here, which obviously do not open until you've drained the fuel off, which I shouldn't need to tell people. But you've got a set of means of purging and filters and a sight gauge there. But again, and then there's a drain off at the bottom. And like on my own yacht, I've got when I did replace my tank, I made sure the tank came down to almost a V with a discharge at the bottom, so that anything that was accumulating couldn't lay on a flat surface. It had a slight V to it, so it will always accumulate in the bottom. And I'm genuinely surprised that, even though I think I'm quite good at fuel management, how often we've picked up a bit of dirty fuel, or we've picked up a bit of dirt from one of the portable tank systems out in Corfu in the Ionian. And even every week I'm just draining a little bit off, and it's quite surprising how you pick up a bit of water in the fuel and stuff from the condensation. So it's a good little bit of husbandry, generally speaking. But again, checking the inside of your tank, whether that's a winter job or spring check before you fill the tank, it's up to you. But I think it's important we all get on top of fuel, because it's not as good as it used to be. That's if you can get any fuel at all at present.
I mean, that was one of the things that sort of came out. What's changed in the fuel then to make it, as you say, not as good as it used to be?
Good question, actually, Paul. I believe it's the content of the plant life, the bio. So basically, all our fuel these days has got an element of bio in it, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure someone will probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but generally it's said to be about 7 to 10%. Although I do know from when I did an article for one of the magazines that one of the places in Ireland can supply up to 60, 70% plant matter. And so it gives this great opportunity for the diesel bug microorganisms. They don't actually grow in the diesel, but they grow in the water where the water is compressed on the bottom of the tanks. And that gives them the opportunity to live there. So that's where a lot of it's going from. And also the length of time fuel lasts now is obviously affected by it as well. I mean, I have a client who as a farmer, and he told me about a time when he had a problem with his John Deere combine. They hadn't used it for since the last harvest. Went to fire it up and nothing would work, and the fuel had literally gone off, and that's the sort of typical diesel bug sediment that comes out the bottom. It's the same stuff that came out my filter, which I've got here. We should probably see that in that one. Quite nice. It's growing in my shed. And it turns out there's black sort of sludgy stuff that's growing everywhere. So, but getting polishing is a good start, and there's plenty of good treatments out there. I'll probably get shot if I mention particularly a really good one, but I will, sod, which is Marine 16s. There are other ones available, but he's got all sorts of great little things to do on them, and I think the RLI use them as well. So it's got to be as good as I think it is, But there are quite a few different companies out there now doing it, but he was certainly one of the ones at the start of the pandemic of diesel bug when it started. So that's good. All right, what's next? Remind me. Batteries. Oh yes. Okay, so on this particular vessel, he had this one was the emergency battery for the generator, and as you probably noticed there, I could push it around with my finger. It's never, I mean, on a barge, I appreciate it's not going to suddenly heel over or roll over, but really all batteries should be secured, and certainly when you're sitting with batteries in a metal engine room, I think having connected terminal covers on is always a good idea as well. So those sort of things are quite useful. Cables, as you can see here, we've got cables running around and being supported by cable ties. I would prefer to see them supported on their own system rather than relying on others. I don't know quite what the hose was all about, but the battery banks here are two thumping great big lorry batteries, and again, running of AC and DC together is never a good idea wherever possible. You've got a charger there, and then this is I think this is the another cranking. Well, that's this cranking battery for the generator again, but there should be on the other side. We had another battery, and again, it wasn't it was in a tray, but didn't fit in the tray particularly well, and it wasn't secured. So things like that, just checking them, and also doing a volt check on them of making sure they're actually going to work, because batteries do love to be cycled, and if they've stood all winter, the chance of them being reactive for you is pretty low. The other thing is, if you're living on a barge or narrowboat or wide beam, and it's like on Friday I went to a boat, the batteries were 4 years old, they've been connected permanently to shore power, they're running the 12-volt system off through the battery charger. As soon as you disconnect the shore power, those batteries were actually dead, because they just lost everything that would work. They just had it. The batteries like cycling, whereas when you're just pulling everything straight through and charging it straight back up, it's never as good. And lots of people are talking about different makes and types of batteries, but you really got to be careful about what you're doing. And certainly on some of these chargers, you can't mix and match your batteries. You've got to have all the same. All right. What's the next one? We're nearly done, I think, aren't we? Interiors. Okay, as with many barges, this one has got a mixture of welding and riveting. Now, I think it was about 1918, 1920, something like that, 21, when we went from iron to steel, but they still weren't particularly great at welding steel until about the early 50s. So a lot of the barges that were built in Holland would still be riveted, and having good access and checking fittings, like there's a blanked discharge here and it's still blanked off. Really should have a proper cap over it, but it's well above the waterline. But all the riveting is all good. And again, I think he used a Dick Solieri type spray on this, which has worked really well, checking all the underside of the plating and having a good look round. It is really good idea. Certainly where the lands are, where the planks lap onto each other and then riveted, is always a notorious place for corrosion to start developing. and starting to do the same jacking as we saw in the first video on the decks. So making sure all those sort of things are clean and protected is really important. I'm not too bothered about the buckling, but what I will say to people is if you've got an old barge and it needs to come out of the water, I start to be a bit more hesitant about having them lifted if they're still riveted. Anything over sort of 70, 80 years old now, as you start lifting, unless they're lifted properly, it's quite common to start knocking, stressing the odd rivet. And you'll start finding that as you go around surveying them, you tap them and the heads will fall off on the outside, which is always not a good idea. So you then spend hours with people having to fill weld the rivets back on. So it's something well worth checking over and looking at carefully. All right. The accommodation side of the vessel, there was actually no access to the bilges at all, if I remember rightly. Paul, was there? So
No.
and again, I'm a strong advocate of having inspection hatches into the bilges, so you can always make sure they're nice and dry. And for the sake of 25, 30 quid, putting a float switch to a buzzer or something wired up to give you a bit of early warning that if there is a bit of water inside the bilges is always a good idea. Because the biggest and hardest thing with most of these boats is they always rot from the inside out. In this case, he's done a really good job that before we fitted everything else, he totally protected the insides of the hull as well. So there we are. I saw a Q&A come up then, so I guess we're going to be hit by a few questions, hopefully.
Yeah, there's a few come in. Would you recommend being lifted out once a year for checks, or can we push it to every second year?
What was it on?
Let's just run through them all. Let's start with the sailing boat then.
Okay, well, sailing boats, most sailing boats that I know of only tend to have anodes suitable for about a year, certainly if they've got pop shaft anodes. So really a yacht with an anode on a shaft, or a motorboat for that matter, really should have at least an hour out of the water to make sure the anodes and fastings are okay. And again, I brought along one of my little friends here, the dreaded Seacocks, because at about 6, 7 years old, everyone says to me, oh yeah, that Seacock looks perfect. But that's the bit that goes through the hull. That's the bit you can't see. And so again, it's always a good time to go and check. And the clue in this one was the externals was starting to get quite pinky. When you look up inside, you can actually start seeing the pink. And as you guys can probably see from that, it completely corroded here. So when the boat was out of the water, even though I said this needs changing, just looking at this side of it, because I didn't think it was particularly clever, and it was over 5, 6 years old, the boatyard guy, when it was out of the water, gave it a little yank and pulled it through the boat. So it was always a good little one. So yeah, out of water checks for things like that, definitely. With narrow boats and inland waterway barges and stuff, the general thought is about 4 to 5 years between blackings. Although I recently attended an Institute of Corrosion, that was it. They did an excellent presentation at the Northern Forum back at the start of March for the YDSA, and their view was the fact that really we should be probably having the boats out of the water a bit more often to keep on top of corrosion, especially with the talk of all the different types of corrosion now flying around on the inland waterways, and galvanic and electrolytic and microbiotic corrosion. They all harbour in the areas where you've damaged the underwater coating. So the sooner you can get them protected, the better for your hull long term. So yeah.
And on that one, what about sort of overplating? Is that sort of?
Oh, you and your.
There's a tricky subject for you.
Right. With my MCA coding surveyor's hat on, overplating is an absolute no-no. Okay, it's as simple as that. It's not allowed. When we start talking about inland waterway craft, it has been historically used for quite a many years in overplating areas where either the plating is thinned off or there's substantial deep pitting on the side of the hull. And sometimes you've got no other option. The first option is if the plate thickness is still at what it should be, you know, give it, say, 6, if it's a 6 mil side plate and it's still predominantly 6 mil, but you've got 3 and 4 mil deep pits, it's sometimes worth shot blasting it or rotor blasting it, which is using a drill with a very good cleaner on the end of it to clean the sides, to actually expose all the areas where the pitting is, and then pay someone for 3 or 4 days, possibly more, of fill welding. Now, the danger with that is you can sometimes set fire to the inside of your boat because it's spray foamed or it's got polystyrene liners inside it. So you've got to really be thinking about what you're doing to start with. But that said, that is better still, in my view, than overplating. But if you've got to the point where the boat is so thin and the cost of cutting it all off and letting in isn't cost effective, then overplating is the dreaded alternative. But it's got to be done properly, where people, what's called puddle weld. So if you've got a plate like that, you're picking up the frames where the frames run inside the boat. So you're actually welding through the plate steel, or you're cutting slots to actually physically pick that up. So the sheet of steel you're putting on the bottom of the boat or the side of the boat is actually picking up on those, rather than being welded to the corroding metal that's already there. And trust me, I've been to a few boats before now, which have someone spent £7,000-8,000 having it professionally overplated, and you can see the plates actually sagging off the hull where there's water got between them, or more importantly, they've literally just zipped a weld around the outside, and the plate they've welded to is now starting to fail. So overplating, if it's done properly and done really well, is probably the last resort, but it's better than nothing. And again, you then have to start looking at all the problems that come with adding more weight, which is the fact that things like your discharges on the side of the boat will now be lower in the water because the boat will float lower. The more important one is the weed hatch. Before now, I've seen boats where the weed hatches are literally kissing the water because they've literally put so much weight onto the boat with a new base plate and new side plating. And it's all been done really well, but then the weed hatch has literally got 1.5 inches of freeboard because the boat has gained so much weight. So you've got to start thinking about alteration of the ballast inside the boat. So there's a lot to be taken into account. I do prefer it when people start cutting the plates off and letting them in, personally. But the devil, you know, sometimes if you've got a boat that's worth £40,000, the cost of doing it properly is probably going to be 2/3 of that, whereas overplating is probably about half the cost. So I understand why people do it, and I understand the pros and cons of it, but it's got to be done properly.
Perfect. And what are your thoughts regarding blacking versus epoxy?
Oh, epoxy every time.
Nice simple one for you that time.
Epoxy every time, but the preparation, you cannot epoxy over old black, and it's got to be bright steel, and you've got to do it exactly as the manufacturer's recommendations are. There's no point in shortcutting it. It's an expensive product, but it's worth absolutely every penny. I mean, I actually was there on the days when they came down to my father's boatyard, a company which I'm probably not allowed to mention. I don't think, no, they don't exist any longer. A company called VC, which were bought out by International. But VC were the people who developed the first epoxy tars in our area in East Anglia. They came down to our boatyard and said, "We've got this wonderful new product." And everyone looked at it and went, "Oh yeah, you know, oh no, it's really good stuff." And they literally shot blast some piles near our boatyard on the jetty, and they shot blast them. And on a really warm summer's day, got that back to bright metal, and they put the coats on. And then when the tide went back out, they washed them all off and put another couple of coats on. And that's still there now. And I've certainly done bits of steel which are 30 plus years old, and the epoxy is still on there. But it's, as I say, it's got to be done absolutely properly, and you've got to get rid of the mill scale. There's no point, even on a brand new piece of steel, you do not epoxy straight onto it. You've got to prep it first.
Another one's just come in. How often should I change the rubber pipe between my prop shaft and the boat's prop shaft inlet?
Excellent one. Good question. Right. So what the gentleman or lady is talking about there is it sounds like they've got a stuffing gland, but they've got a flexi piece of hose, so it makes it a flexible coupling onto the stern tube. Now, generally, 5 to 7 years is a sensible thing. There is actually one of my YouTube videos somewhere, I think, or I've got it on one of my photographs from one of my talks I do to sailing clubs, where someone has Jubilee clamped it so tight, but they haven't pushed the hose on properly, so it's actually squeezing it off the ends of the tube. So there's nothing actually holding that piece of tube on. But the piece of tube, the rubber pipe you're talking about, isn't just a piece of normal rubber pipe. It's essential you get a proper piece of flexi stern tube for it. It's proper, it's real proper reinforced piece of tube. Don't just go and buy a normal bit of rubber pipe because it will fail. All right. And it's really important that when you put it on and then you've got your stuffing gland that goes in the end of that, that your stuffing gland is also done so it's not over tight. Because if you make it too tight, then you're loading the rubber flexi tube. But very, very good question, that one, like that.
Oh, and to follow up with that one is, how often should we be changing our gas pipes?
Every 5 years is my view. The orange hose in particular, I think it's colour in somewhere in their manual, they say 5 years from when you put the gas through. And the reason for that is I've actually been to boat yards where they fitted new gas pipe and the gas hose they're fitting is 2 years old coming out the workshop. But the Cala did say when I checked with them that it was from when your gas is first passed. And the thing that really infuriates me, and I don't want to get drawn into this one too much, is there are particular checks that go on that say that they visually check the hose. Well, unless you can actually check the porosity of that hose, you can't tell if it's leaking or not. I was on a little barge only last week. The gas hoses on them were 2013, so they were obviously old. The boat was built in 2013, so we know that the gas was supplied from that date. But more importantly, when you open the locker, you got a whiff of gas. And straight away you knew that even though the copper pipe was good, the regulator looked okay. I'll come on to that in a minute. But the only thing that could have been leaking was the hose, yet the hose looked perfect. I went and bought myself a little 50 quid gas sniffer, which I use when I go through the bilges of a boat, which is another reason why I like access into the bilges of a boat, because you can't, gas alarms in the boat are not expensive, but even if you go and buy yourself a 50 quid gas sniffer and check the bilges once a week, that's going to be better than anything else. But be aware that if you've got a hob in a galley area, sometimes that's not solid connected. And a number of times I do a survey where people say, what are you looking at? I'm trying to get a photograph to see in between the underside of the hob to see if it's solid connection or if it's got a flexi hose. And quite often they've used a piece of reinforced hose there. And again, sometimes they're 15, 20 years old and they should be changed every 5 years. So be aware of that one. If you've got a gas hob on board your boat in a galley, go and check to see if it's a solid connection, which is great. If it's gas hose, make sure it's under 5 years old. And if you've been on board the boat for over 5 years and you haven't changed it, I know what the answer is to that one. And with the regulator, this is what always makes me laugh. I did a gas course. Believe it or not, I used to fit gas in the 80s as part of the boat building training. Apparently you're competent. But I did a YDSA gas course a couple of years ago, and the guy read out the regulations for regulators. He said, so which one of these regulators complies? And he had a room, 5 or 6 different regulators in front of us. And we all sort of pointed to different ones. He said, well, actually, none of them comply because the body should be stainless steel, but no one makes a stainless steel bodied regulator for the marine industry. So everything we use isn't technically marine compliant in that one item. So it's really important, again, to check your regulators and look at changing them probably every 5 or 6 years as well, just as a good measure. You'll know when the regulator's gone wrong because you'll have flames about 4 foot high in the galley on the hob.
You'll notice that one then. And yeah, that's
oh yes. Absolutely.
And how would you say it's best to clean your freshwater tank?
Just keep flushing it over, and I think people use Miltons and stuff like that. And again, just watch the hoses and pipe work, because I have been on a few boats, especially DIY fit outs, where they use garden hoses, And again, you really mustn't drink out of anything other than proper water pipe. It will give you potential bits of cancer if you're not careful. But certainly regular flushing is a good idea. And again, in the winter webinar, we talked about draining off, didn't we? Taking the water pump apart. And again, don't forget, on most water pumps, they have a little filter gauze on the side of them. So take them off and give them a thoroughly good cleaning, some Miltons or something to kill any of the bugs that are sitting there, and run it through like that. Okay. And
Cool.
if you're filling, don't use a garden hose for filling. Use a proper water safe hose as well.
That's interesting, and that's that. And if you're filling up from a marina, all those should be sort of all pretty much using the right sort of stuff.
Well, most of the marinas, that's why they guard their hoses like they do, because they're not cheap, but they are damn sight safer than using a garden hose.
And if you think your fuel may be contaminated, what's the best way to drain it off, dispose of it, and then do you need to clean everything through and flush it?
So this is a very good question. The first thing is identification of what it is. Is it diesel bug, or is it just a bit of water accumulation? So draining off from the bottom of the tank if you can. If not, you need to get a hose or a pipe from your filler down and try and suck back the other way. And what I would say is have a look at it. I probably should have gone and grabbed the bottle of what I've got, so I could have shown you it. But the video clip that Chris had up earlier is very representative of it. You know, drain on Chianti when I first bought her. We must have drained off about, it's a 300-gallon tank, and we must have 300 litre tank, and we must have drained off about 50-60 litres before we actually got anything that was actually clear. And obviously it's important the boat is still. And again, it's down to how much fuel have you got. If you've got if you've got a yacht with only like a 10-gallon day tank, or 10-gallon or 20-gallon tank, personally, from the experience I've had, I would say pump it all out, go and put it into your local recycling centre, you know, or council recycling centre where they take fuel and oil. Ironically, I had a fisherman who wanted the diesel to running his diesel heater in his workshop, so he was happy to take it. But not everyone, I'm sure, has got a friendly fisherman who was prepared to sieve it and do his best with it. But sometimes, depending on the quantity, it's sometimes cheaper and quicker just to remove it all and start again. If, like in Charlie's case, in my case, you've got 300 litres or 700 gallons, then you're into removing what I call the worst of it, gravity-wise, until you get something that looks reasonably okay, and then starting to do what's called polishing, which is basically you can hire or you can subcontract in companies that will do diesel polishing for you, where they will just come in and they'll turn the fuel over probably 30-40 times in the tank, and put it through loads of fine filters to get rid of it all, and then they will treat it with something like I've said, sorry, Marine 16, but they will dose it with biocides. But the important bit is to try and stop the reasons why. So things like making sure that when you're not using the boat, your tank is full, so there's little chance of water getting in there. Making sure that your fuel filler cap is the right type that covers the threads so the water can't get down inside. If you've got the type that have threads where water potentially can lay on, try and use some grease of some sort, or silicone grease, and make sure the seals are right. There are on the market, they're quite hard to find for the air intakes, because every time you take fuel out of a tank, air has to come back in from somewhere. So all fuel tanks will have an air breather, of making sure that there is a proper swan neck loop. Let me do that like that. So it does that to go to the outside, so the water can't just run straight down into the tank. But also make sure that the gauze on the breather is intact. And the number of times I go on narrow boats and they've got the gauze on the top of the cleat on the stern of the boat, and it's been damaged where people have put a rope around it and caught it. So look at your breathers and make sure the water trap gauze is in place. If it's not, replace it. And then if you can get, but they are quite hard to find, is what's called a desiccant filter. And what that does is it will trap the water, stop the water being pulled back into your tank, or damp air. back into your tank, which will then allow it to breed in the tank. So that's really where you are, and then change your filters and purge the fuel through your fuel pump.
Brilliant. As the owner of a GRP Westerly 33, I prefer to keep, he prefers to keep his boat on the water all year round and dry her out against a harbour wall only to anti-foul her.
Yeah.
As a minimum, how often for how long should I leave her on the hard to dry out the hull to preserve the GRP long term?
Probably a bit too late now. If it's been done for many, many, many years. Westerlies are notorious for being built out of chop strand man, which is very short strands and very little woven rovings. So all the filaments are quite keen to get water. I mean, I used to keep my boat out of the water. My current yacht is in luxury because it spends most of its time out the water in the Ionian and only goes in the water when we use it. So she is mega dry. She's 42 years old, so she's mega dry. But certainly, old yachts over 30 years old, I would certainly say that now's the time to start thinking of having them out the water for at least the 3 months every winter or spring, before spring. So you're giving it a chance. But the secret really is to make sure the internals are dry as well. You'll start to notice if things are starting to go wrong, because when you set the boat down, you'll notice that the boat will start to become a bit soft over the keel. It may start doing, I guess it's a thin keel if he's laying up against the wall. So again, you'll start noticing a bit of a general sagging starting. And again, I've done some YouTube videos on that to try and explain it to people. When you tap around with a hammer, you'll start to hear the dullness of the laminate. But it is really important. And the first clue is going to be blisters, unfortunately. And they're not always outside. I had a Saddler 29 where the boat was so wet that even the inside pan lining was developing sort of 15-20 mil blisters inside in the bilges, because the hull was that wet, because it's got a foam core between the two. But certainly any of the older boats, keeping the boat dry inside is just as important as outside. But very nice.
And one final question, lithium batteries.
Oh yes. Your favourite.
My favourite one. Is there any sort of checks to do at the beginning of the season?
Well, the problem with lithium, and we're starting to find this more and more, is lots of people have jumped into lithium without thinking of the temperature controls of them. And I think we were asked this question at the winter webinar, and I went away and found out afterwards, because I've never been asked it before. And then when I mentioned it to one or two people, they went, funny enough, you mentioned that. We've used lithium, and when we came to start using the batteries in the spring, we found they were completely dud. But we'd had a very hard frost. So hopefully the first thing is you've kept them in a nice warm place through the winter, because they do not like going below. I think it's 8 degrees or something bizarre. The old grey cells, I do apologise, they're a bit but there is a temperature that they don't like going below. So that's the first thing. But again, with lithium, as with all the other types of batteries, if you've got a battery charger, it's really important to make sure you've put the battery charger on the right setting. Because I had someone actually blow up a set of batteries because they'd set them onto one type of battery, and the battery charger thought they were another type and was basically over pumping them. So if any good advice is, make sure the cables are correct, make sure that all the terminals are tight, do a little check on them to make sure they are actually okay, but more importantly, make sure your charging system, automatic charging system, knows the type of battery it's charging.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. All that remains for me is that's the end of the questions, to say thank you, everybody, for turning up, for listening, and for posting such great questions. Some challenges in there for Ben, I think. But
thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Ben also for giving up his time today to run through all our spring checks. Just one last little piece of housekeeping is the fact that obviously this video will be available to you all afterwards, and there is a new video coming out where Ben and I went and looked at trailerable boats. We'll be bringing that out as a video that'll go up on our YouTube channel in the not too distant future, just to sort of continue on this theme. It's all about the trailers and all things to check on the boats before you put them in the water or launch them from the trailer, or even take the trailer on the road. So we hope you all get a chance to watch that. But otherwise, thank you very much again for all attending, and we'll catch up with you soon.
It's always a privilege and a pleasure that people are that interested to listen to my sad watterings on. But thank you very much for joining us all. Thank you. Cheers, guys.